thought I'd do something a little bit different this week by taking a look at a line that I've not really covered an awful lot of in the past. This is Mattel's line of DC Multiverse figures, long before McFarlane Toys had licensed this. And what's quite interesting about this line is that it was covering all different eras of the DC universe at that time. Now, as you may be familiar, I'm not a huge DC Comics fan, I'm much more of a Marvel guy, but I do love Batman, and in particular the Batman films, because they are the first superhero films that I was introduced to as a child, so I'm always going to have a soft spot for the Tim Burton Batman films in particular. And I must say, as a fan of those films, I feel like we've been ill-served across the years from toy companies simply not giving us action figures in the 6 and 7 inch scales of some of those movie characters. A lot of that, I would imagine, has to do with license rights. But Mattel attempted to bridge that gap by producing a handful of figures in their DC Multiverse line. And today I'm going to take a look at a long sought after action figure, the Penguin from Batman Returns. So as ever, let's start off by taking a look at this packaging. Now, unusually, it's actually quite broad for a 6-inch action figure. It is mostly window display, which is great. We can see the figure and all his accessories on display there, so this looks pretty good. I do really like how they have the Batman Returns logo in the top right-hand corner. That gives it its own identity, which is pretty cool. And we do have an image there of Danny DeVito taken from Batman Returns in the left-hand corner, which is quite nice. Again, it clearly gives this figure an identity of what film it belongs to. So all of that is quite nice. Overall, the design does look a little bit clunky, I would say. It does kind of feel like a hodgepodge of different things sort of thrown in there. And I suppose the idea is that this is consistent. The packaging would be consistent across all the other figures in this DC Multiverse line. So regardless of whether you're looking at a figure from a cartoon, from a film, from a TV show, from the comic books, it's all going to look pretty seamless in the collection. So I understand that impulse. I think that is a smart move. But nevertheless, the design elements do look a little bit hodgepodge in my opinion. If we look at the side panel though, I really like this. I think they've used this space very wisely by putting that image there of Danny DeVito's Penguin. I think this looks really, really good. And again, if you put these other figures in the line next to each other, it's going to look pretty consistent and pretty fun as well, which is key. On the reverse of the packaging, up front and centre, we have the image of the action figure himself, which looks pretty nice. He's just on a basic blue background. Again, this is consistent with the overall theme of this line of figures. So this is fine. It's not the most exciting image in the world. At the top, again, we do have that image of Danny DeVito's Penguin. It's looking a little bit overused at this point, but hey, it's still absolutely fine. And as I say, gives it that distinct personality, which is totally cool. Interestingly, we can only see one other figure in this line, and they've chosen to go with Heath Ledger's Joker, which seems odd considering there are other figures from the Tim Burton era Batman films that they could have put here, so that's kind of a strange choice, but nevertheless it's only a very small image and it still looks fine all in all. So this generally is pretty nice packaging. I think it's pretty displayable, if a little bland in some areas, but still very nice to put on display. Now, before we look at the action figure himself, I did want to pull out this interior inlay where you can see, of course, it is just a basic blue background there, so nothing particularly exciting there. You will, however, notice that this figure does come with its own display stand, which is labelled specifically for this character, which is a nice touch. I think this looks really quite good, actually, and unexpected for a 6-inch scale figure. But it also has this wonderful background as well, which I think is a really nice touch. So it is creating a sort of display stand for your figure, and just elevates your 6-inch collection when you put them on display. So I think this is a very nice touch. I've long wanted a 6 or 7-inch scale Penguin figure from Batman Returns, and this figure manages to be simultaneously both quite impressive but also underwhelming in equal measure. So if we start off by looking at this head sculpt, it's actually not bad. This is actually a pretty decent likeness of Danny DeVito. Now, it's not very sharp, there's a lot of detail missing, it's quite a soft likeness, I suppose, but overall, the shape of the head, the look, the expression on the face, I think they've done a pretty decent job here. Now, Mattel isn't known for hyper-detailed figures. They tend to be a little bit more toyetic, I would say, when compared with, say, Marvel Legends or McFarlane Toys. But all that being said, this is still pretty serviceable and it does the job, and there's some decent paint apps here, particularly around the eyes, that give this a little bit more texture, which is pretty cool. And I have to say, the addition of this cloth cloak is really effective. I really love that we have this extra texture in there, and I think this is really fun and elevates this figure quite significantly. On the other hand, the base mould for the torso is a little bit disappointing and underwhelming. This feels very plasticky, it feels very hollow, it feels very lightweight, and although there's some nice detailing on the actual tunic of this waistcoat, there really isn't very much in the way of paint apps to really draw out this sculpting and to make more of this. A little bit of shading, a little bit of a wash running through this would have just give it a bit more texture. As a result, it just looks a little bit bare bones and a little bit toyetic, I suppose. Likewise, if we look at that cravat, it's a nice effort and they've dotted that with some nice silver paint, but it just looks a little bit, I suppose, amateurish in a sense, and it just doesn't look very authentic, and it just feels very much like a plastic toy. I also wanted to point out two things with the arm here when we remove the cloak. As you can see, the cloak has stained the arms a little bit, which sort of ruins the look, but hey, it does give it that wash I was asking for a moment ago. But so that is a little bit disappointing that you can see that staining coming through. It does kind of ruin the aesthetic a little bit here if you want to go cloakless. The other thing I wanted to mention is just how unseemly this joint is, how the central body piece just fits over the arms. They don't look quite to scale, this looks a little bit clunky, and that gap between the joints is just a little bit unseemly. To Mattel's credit, there's an awful lot of unique pieces for this particular figure that actually make it quite individual and interesting, and one of the things I think they've done well are his hands, or flippers. These are nicely sculpted and they've used a nice reflective shiny material that really captures that sort of PVC feel or look that they have in the film. As I mentioned, the cravat doesn't look great in my personal opinion, but I do think it looks a lot better when the cloak is on and you look at it from a distance perhaps. Now if we look at the legs, it's very nice that they've actually sculpted in the corduroys. I really like that effect. I think this looks pretty good in the main, and we can see obviously he's got some decent sculpting when it comes to the shoes. You can see there's at least an attempt to sort of recreate some shoelaces there, although it's not very defined and obviously not very detailed, but this is quite nice. It does look like there's some different textures here which are quite effective. Now sadly, articulation is quite limited with this figure. He does have a ball joint in the neck, but you can't really move his head at all, which is a real shame. That long hair piece at the back just prevents it from moving from side to side or up or down, which is a real waste. Now he does have ball joints in the shoulders as we've seen, so he can lift his arms up and out a little bit. There is a pin swivel at the elbow, so that lower arm can rotate all the way around, and it will hinge to about 45 degrees. There's another pin swivel at the wrist there, so again that wrist can rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. And then he has this fantastic ball joint in the waist, which is really surprisingly effective. He can move up and down from side to side and lean left and right, so there's a huge range of motion here. In fact, the whole movement of this figure pivots on this one joint. Sadly, he only has a hinge at the hips. Those legs will not come out to the sides. He does have an upper thigh swivel though, which is fine, but not hugely effective. And to be honest, I wasn't really able to get the most out of the articulation that is there in that joint to allow the legs to kick forwards or backwards. I couldn't seem to get it to move at all. Now, he does have a pin swivel at the lower leg though, so he can rotate his leg from side to side. It should hinge to about 90 degrees, but mine doesn't really want to. And then finally, he does have a pivot at the ankle, allowing his foot to kick forwards and backwards a little bit and turn from left to right. He also comes with some cool accessories as well, including an alternate pair of hands, his top hat, his umbrella, and a smoke effect. Now the top hat is a pretty cool addition, but sadly it just rests on his head and not very securely. This thing wants to fall off all the time, so you are totally relying on gravity to hold this in place. His umbrella is pretty cool, sculpted quite nicely, and there's some decent paint apps on here as well. It is all made of rubber, which is the only thing, so it does tend to be a little bit bendy, but he grips it with no issues, and it looks pretty good when it's in his hands. And the firing bullet smoke effect looks pretty cool too, I have to say. This actually is quite dramatic and really transforms the overall look of this figure, and I think this is quite nicely done. In terms of a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to the 7-inch NECA Batman figure. I actually think this looks really quite good. The scaling looks pretty accurate, especially if we remove that top hat, then this height differential looks much stronger, and I think this looks pretty consistent. So I'm actually really quite pleased that we can kind of put these figures together. Certainly the Penguin looks a little bit more toyetic, as you would expect, but these still look pretty good together, I have to say. All in all then, a pretty interesting release from Mattel. Certainly has its downsides, not great when it comes to articulation, some definite detail lacking and just a little bit plasticky in certain places, a little bit lightweight, which is a real shame. But on the other hand, there's actually some surprising details in here. I really do love the fabric cloak that they've given him. I think this is very effective. There's some decent articulation in the waist, and the overall look and aesthetic of the figure actually works pretty well. And for someone who's long wanted a Danny DeVito penguin, this will certainly serve my needs. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.